Good morning, good later morning. 11Zs, as they say in The Hobbit. It's 11Zs. We are happy to, I'm just the voice that sort of suggests that there will be now many voices to one voice. And welcome back after a really wonderful morning session on architecture in the built environment. We have when we said yesterday that we're going to have a novelists panel, we're very excited about this format, and I'm going to introduce the introducer and chair of this panel, Nathaniel Rich, just very briefly. Nathaniel is a professor in our environmental studies program. He's also the program director of the environmental studies program. He himself is a very accomplished author on both environmental journalism and environmental topics, writes not only Losing Earth, his most recent book, which has now just been announced, has sold the film rights, will be a major motion picture, in his work that appears in the New York Times Magazine, most recently on the cover on environmental topics. You should read all of that. He's also written of his 3 novels, yes, his 3 published novels. One, King Zeno, is also a novel set in the port city of New Orleans, so we thought he would be a perfect chair for this panel. Let me introduce Nathaniel to the stage.
Thank you all. It's a pleasure to be here and to contribute in a very minor way to the work of the Global Humanities Center. And I've been very stimulated the last week trying to define for myself the port novel, the literature, the port literature, port novel, and port fiction, and what that might mean. And I guess where I am so far is there should be some kind of, to be set in a port. It should be, how do you define port? I don't know, but some polyglot aspect, I'm thinking, some cosmopolitan quality. Another association would be a kind of high-low, sort of low life, upper crust, some kind of mingling of those, crime. That's sort of where, and then I was thinking, well, what are the port novels, port city novels? What's the canon? And I guess my nominees would be a lot of Joseph Conrad, Herman Melville, Alvaro Mutis. I would say Ítalo Svevo, who's close to my heart. Trieste, port city. Ulysses, perhaps, Joyce. Neuromancer was one sort of long shot, set in a futuristic port city, William Gibson. Count of Monte Cristo, I'm reading with my child now. That's very much a port novel. But Jean-Claude Izzo, Marseille. That's as far as I've gotten. So I'm excited to have these wonderful writers, Myriam and Yuri, come up with Chelsea, and I'm going to introduce them in their books to help answer some of these questions and sort of refine this very crude portrait into something a bit more crystalline. I will begin with Myriam J. Chancy. She's the author most recently of the novel Village Weavers, published by Tin House, a Time-Best book of April 24, and winner of the 2025 Fiction OCM Bocas Award in Caribbean Literature. Her work has received multiple awards, including an American Book Award from the Before Columbus Foundation, the Guyana Prize in Literature, a Forward Indies Book of the Year Award Gold Prize, and the Isis Duarte Book Prize. Her past novels include What Storm, What Thunder, The Loneliness of Angels, The Scorpion's Claw, and Spirit of Haiti. She's also the author of several academic books, including Harvesting Haiti and Framing Silence. She's a Guggenheim Fellow and HBA Chair of the Humanities at Scripps College in California. Village Weavers, I feel like I'd like to hold these up. Okay. Is this it? Oh, no.
I got one.
Oh, thank you. That would be awkward, yeah. Village Weavers. In 1940s Port-au-Prince, Gertie and Sissy become fast childhood friends, despite being on opposite ends of the social and economic ladder. As young girls, they build their unlikely friendship until a deathbed revelation ripples through their families and tears them apart. After Francois Duvalier's rule turns deadly in the 1950s, Sissy moves to Paris while Gertie marries into a wealthy Dominican family. Across decades and continents, through personal success and failures, they're parted and reunited, slowly learning the truth of their singular relationship. Finally, 6 decades later, with both women in the United States, a sudden phone call brings them back together once more to reckon with and perhaps forgive the past. Our other author is Yuri Herrera-Gutiérrez. There. Okay. Right, I thought. Okay. This is in the original. Season of the Swamp. Born in Actopan, Mexico, Yuri Herrera-Gutiérrez is the author of 4 novels, including Season of the Swamp, which was a finalist for the 2024 Los Angeles Times Prize for Fiction, and winner of the Queen Sofia Spanish Institute Translation Prize. His first novel to appear in English, Signs Preceding the End of the World, was published to great acclaim in 2015 and included in many Best of the Year lists, including The Guardian's Best Fiction and NBC News' 10 Great Latino Books, going on to win the 2016 Best Translated Book Award. All of his novels have been translated into English by Lisa Dillman, which I think is really cool to have the same translator. That's an exciting idea. Herrera-Gutiérrez teaches at Tulane here. And Season of the Swamp, New Orleans, 1853. A young exile named Benito Juarez disembarks at a fetid port city at the edge of a swamp. Who are you calling fetid? Years later, he will become the first indigenous head of state in the post-colonial Americas, but now he is as anonymous and invisible as any other migrant to the roiling and alluring city of New Orleans. Accompanied by a small group of fellow exiles who plot their return and hope for victory over the Mexican dictatorship, Juarez immerses himself in the city, which absorbs him like a sponge. He and his compatriots work odd jobs, suffer through the heat of a southern summer, fall victim to the cons and confusions of a strange young nation, succumb to the hallucinations of yellow fever, and fall in love with the music and food all around them. But unavoidable, too, is the grotesque traffic in human beings they witness as they try to shape their future. And the moderator of the panel today will be Chancy, who's an associate professor and Gore Chair in French Studies at Tulane, specializing in 19th century Caribbean literature, history, and culture with an emphasis on Haiti. She's the author of Haiti's Paper War, Post-Independence Writing, Civil War and the Making of the Republic, 1804 to 1854, and co-editor of the critical translation of Louis Joseph Janvier's Haiti for the Haitians, 2023. She's currently working on 2 book projects. The first is an exploration of writing from free people of color in the Antilles during the period of general emancipation and its aftermath. And the second is a project on Caribbean fascism, for which she was awarded an ACLS fellowship. Please join me in welcoming them all to the conversation. I look forward to it.
I must.
You have one already.
Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Nathaniel. And thank you, everyone, for being here. I am so honored to be able to moderate this discussion after what's been an excellent first day and an excellent morning. And of course, everyone's brains are buzzing. I'm also happy that we're able to do a slightly different format. We will not do presentations. We will converse, which is exciting and also sometimes a little nerve-wracking because we have no idea where it's going to go. I did my duty, though, and sent far too many notes and thoughts, and we'll see. But I am sure we will have a wonderful discussion, and I look forward to opening it up to the audience because I think we'll be able to make a lot of connections and hopefully answer Nathaniel's provocative question, what is the Port Novel? And so I'm excited. I want to start actually just asking you to share your personal connections to Louisiana, New Orleans, this space, and maybe a little bit about the histories of the places that you write about, Mexico and Haiti, in relation to New Orleans. Myriam,
No
please
one
go
wants to
first.
start. Well, first of all, thank you very much, for everyone who's organized this symposium, for having us here, and I want to especially thank Chancy for inviting me in particular, and the kind of conversation we've already been engaged in around Haiti and port cities, and putting me in conversation with Yuri. So I'm looking forward to what develops in our conversation now. So, you know, I confessed to Chelsea and the world that I used to be a professor down the highway from here at LSU many years ago. And I was lured, you know, with tales of Haiti's connection to Louisiana. And I, you know, went there with all the anticipation of finding a lot of Haitian connections. And so what I found when I used to live here is that in fact there's a very, very entangled and complicated relationship between Louisiana and Haiti, obviously going back to before the Haitian Revolution, but becoming ever more complicated by those exchanges. And that there are actually a number of sort of conflicts around what constitutes the Haitian immigration or refugees who came to this area during the period of revolution and immediately in its aftermath. And so, and this means racial entanglements, ethnic, cultural entanglements, free enslaved, as opposed to white plantation owners, you know, coming to the area and what that has meant. But also the impact of the fear of Haitian, you know, the legacy of the revolution and, you know, Maroonism or fugitivism, you know, whatever you want to call it, but basically rebellion on plantations. And so living in Baton Rouge at the time, I heard a story by a historian at one of the plantations, which you'll not find very easily in history books, which is that in the late 1700s, in the aftermath of the beginning of the revolution, you know, word came to this area about these rebellions. And so there was an overt attempt to quell rebellion of the plantation estates, and those enslaved Africans who were believed to be heading or fomenting rebellions were killed. Their heads were cut off, and they were exhibited at the end of the plantations along the Mississippi, all the way from Baton Rouge to New Orleans. And that was a way to let, you know, the enslaved population know this is what will happen to you if you rebel. It's a very little known, talked about episode, but it's actually factual, and it did quell rebellion, but it also instilled in the long memory of the area a kind of antithetical relationship to Haitians at the same time as there is still this long history of people coming, you know, between the two port cities. So I think that's where I would begin, that there is a kind of fear of Haitians as well as a kind of acceptance that there are Haitians amongst us in the area. But not everybody is actually Haitian. So that's a whole other matter.
Right. Do we say Saint-Domingue? Do we say Haiti, right?
Exactly.
Where is the line?
And also whether you were a plantation owner or a free person of color or an enslaved person. So.
Oh, well, that could be a conversation for the entire panel. However, that was just the start. Thank you, Myriam. Yuri, please.
Thank you. Yeah, it's working. Well, I arrived here in 2011, not really knowing where I was coming. I have heard about New Orleans. I knew all the cliches about New Orleans. But it was until I came here that I started realizing that the city was much more than Bourbon Street, and was much more than a name in many songs. And actually, like all the people who live in New Orleans, I never go to Bourbon Street. You know, it's like one of the signs that they actually have started being a citizen of the city. I always think that how do you realize you belong to a place? I always think that you have to have three things. One, you must work in the place, because if you're not working, you are a tourist, and you know, you are just expecting people to serve you. You must have some sort of love relation of any kind. It can be from marriage, which is my kind, to a one-night stand that regrettably I never had here. And you must have some sort of enemy, you know, someone who doesn't like you, because if you are in a place where everybody likes you, it's like you really are not in that place. You just have to exist for someone to dislike you a little bit. And I have the three of those things in New Orleans. So I think now I belong to New Orleans. But I belong to New Orleans in the same way that I still belong to Mexico. I feel comfortable saying that I have two homes. I go as much as possible back to Mexico, and I'm happy to be part of a really long line of people that have been sometimes well-known, more often unknown, that have established this relation. And I'm just going to mention two or three. Well, of course, Benito Juárez. Then in 85, you know, in the World Fair in New Orleans, the Mexican government sent a huge number of musicians to become to be part of the fair, and they were a success. They stayed for weeks, and then they kept coming every year. And now many people credit this influence of these musicians as part of the emergence of jazz years later. And not a lot of people know that there's this sculptor from Zacatecas called Enrique Alferez, who has created some of the most important, more iconic buildings and facades in New Orleans. The Charity Hospital, the Lakefront Airport, and some other places. And in City Park, there are a lot of his sculptures. So he is a Mexican artist that always assumed that he was a Mexican artist, but his influence was very important in a place that praises its architecture the way New Orleans does. And the last thing that I would say is that in different ways, the Mexican community was part of the reconstruction of New Orleans after Katrina. First, right after the hurricane, one of the few things that then President Fox did well is that he sent a bunch of trucks to New Orleans with food and with things to help. And he made clear that they were Mexican. They all had a huge Mexican flag in the front, you know. So, and those were military trucks, which is it's a nice thing to remember, you know, Mexican military trucks getting into New Orleans, but to help. Also, a lot of workers from Central America, a lot of workers from Brazil, from Ecuador, and from Mexico. And just recently, when the thugs from ICE were terrorizing the people here, a lot of people were remembering this. Like, you know, migrants are not just visitors. Migrants are not just an accident. They are an integral part of our community. So, well, I would say this is just like an example of that.
Thank you. I actually want to pursue each of these sort of pieces: exile, sort of duality, maybe even sort of a multiplicity of belonging. But I also maybe want to seed those for thoughts, for questions. So maybe I want to move more to the port space specifically for us to talk about. This is the Global Port Cities Conference, and I think, you know, thinking about perhaps the port novels, whether or not you would define your novels as port novels, but what role the port plays or what it does for meaning making, for spatial orientation, for plot movement, for all of this within your novels, I think would be really interesting to discuss. And to get us to that, I was hoping you could both read passages from your books first. We can maybe have you in conversation and then come back to the port. So Myriam, would you?
Speak first or read first?
Read first, please.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. With that idea in mind.
Okay. Well, since you've already heard a summary of Village Weavers, I won't give you that, but we basically find our main characters, Cece and Gertie, in their old age, in their 70s, reconnecting because of his phone call. And the novel is set up in a conversation between the two of them, and then going back to their discrete memories of being in Haiti in the 1940s, which is a period that very few people really know about, where many people came to Haiti, particularly because World Expo was there. And it brought people from all over, especially from the United States. And, you know, speaking of jazz, Dizzy Gillespie, Miles Davis, Celia Cruz was there, and it also created stars of Haitians. So you're beginning in the 90s, you're in the early 2000s, going back to the 40s, and then you meet the characters again as they find each other at different periods in their lives over time. But I wanted to focus on the port What also runs through my literature is references to Vodou, which many people, especially I think, well, in the Louisiana context, I think it can go both ways, whether people have a good understanding of Vodou or a negative one. My approach is obviously very positive. So in Village Weavers, the gods that are talked about are the Simbi, who are the river gods that connect the rivers to the ocean. So I'm going to read a brief passage where the older sister of one of the girls takes the girls to the port. And I think it'll give you a good indication of how the port plays a role in this novel. And then we can talk further about what that means. And so Margie's about 10 years, 12 years older than these girls who are about 6. Close your eyes, Margie intones. Feel, smell the sea air. Without opening her own eyes, which are lightly closed, she adds, Mamie is right. There's nothing like the sea air to cure. One of the girls has been ill. Gertie closes her eyes, takes a deep breath, and brings the salt air into her lungs, along with the briny smell of a catch remaining in the nets below. Isn't this amazing, Margie continues. Isn't this lovely? She points to the young fisherman below. One of those guys tried to convince me that he was a Simbi, come from the interior to join with the sea. She laughs. Incredible. But who's to say he isn't? She squints. What do you mean? Cece asks. Momo, her grandmother, told me about the Simbi when I was helping her count the beans. I thought no one could see the Simbi. Usually no, Margie responds, but sometimes the Simbi can inhabit a person. That's how they can get from the water to land, from river to ocean bed to shore. Cece frowns. Why did he tell you he was a Simbi? Margie laughs again. He was trying to take me away in his chaloupe, said he could take me far away for days into the ocean and to other lands. She looks down at the girls on either side of her. Don't worry, he was joking. He's not a Simbi. He can't be. How do you know? Gertie asks. She's never heard of a Simbi. Such stories are not told in her house. You don't know the story then, Margie says, looking at Gertie. They are the spirit of the waters, of rivers and ocean. They bring the two together. They watch over those who have been blessed or given over to the waters at birth, but also those who come to them later in humility, holding all of nature's beings sacred. They keep their children from drowning if they can help it, but they drown those who violate the rules of nature. Do you know what that means? Gertie shakes her head no. Margie puts a hand on Gertie's shoulder. I know it's not easy to be an ascendant. I've known your older sisters forever, and I wish I didn't. André and Altagracia terrorized us when I was your age, and they were still in high school. Yvonne and Fidelia, who are around my age, aren't any nicer. That family. Her voice trails off as she looks into Gertie's face with undisguised pity. But you know that yourself. You can be sure that if your sisters came in contact with a Simbi, they would drown and never be brought back to the surface. Cece gasps. As if to puncture Margie's pronouncement, a large wave rolls in, crashing and breaking into frothy spume beneath them. Gertie stares at Margie. How does she know about her sister's meanness? Gertie wants to ask Margie more questions, but she remains silent, trying to understand what Margie is saying about the Simbi. The Simbi will show you who to love, who to leave alone. That's what Momo says, Cece interjects. But how, Gertie ventures, how will we know? Her sisters are fond of telling her that anything to do with the spirits, the mystère, is false. She wants to know if her sisters are wrong, if the spirits can bring her friendship, love, bring her to a better world than the place of struggle and loneliness she knows at home. Margie shrugs. When the Simbi appear, you'll know. They will come to you in dreams. You might see them beneath the surface, but watch out. The girls jump. Margie whispers, if you come face to face with a Simbi, they might charm you. Cece giggles. Gertie can see written on Cece's face that she loves these stories about the Loa. She shows no fear of them. Well, Margie continues, amused, they might look like mermaids, or they might look like little girls with long hair, like the both of you, or they might be angels that haunt the eaves at church. Be prepared to feel overwhelmed, to tap into a power greater than yourself. You might be afraid, but you have to fight for that greater thing and let no one convince you otherwise. But how will I know what to fight for? Gertie asks. Margie thinks for a moment. My guess is that you'll know because if you don't fight, What you'll lose will be greater than what you had before. You'll lose more than you had. Then she closes her eyes again, and the three sit together silently, listening to the lapping water beneath them, imagining the Simbi as water snakes or mermaids swimming by, calling out. Gertie doesn't know what to make of Margie's pronouncements, with the warmth of her charm like the sun rising into the sky at mid-morning. None of her older sisters speak like her. Gertie's older sisters are always in a hurry, leaving or arriving into Léogane, another port city, leaving or arriving into Port-au-Prince, leaving or arriving at a beach on the far outskirts of a city. They would never walk down to the port area, which they claim is unsafe and filled with transients. They wouldn't stop to sniff the morning air or get up early to watch a sunrise. It isn't that they are busy like Sissy's mother or grandmother. They can't be bothered with such things. But neither are they goddesses. Margie looks and acts like one, the depth of the ebony brown of her skin, like so many polished votives to be offered to the Loa. Though Gertie has never seen a Vodou ceremony herself, she can imagine Margie in the white dress of an initiate, her hair turbaned, her skirts fanning around her like white hot flames surrounding the wick of a candle. If Margie is fire, then they are moths attracted to the heat. Gertie makes a mental note as her entire body is awash in crests of sea air, not to tell her sisters any detail of where she has been. It will be a treasure she will hold tightly to her chest.
Thank you, Myriam. I would love to have the contrast. Yep, jump right in.
I'm going to read two short excerpts, one from the very beginning that is actually a description of the port, and then another passage that apparently has nothing to do with the port, but has to do with what I would call like the epistemological aspects of the port. The badges dragged the man from the ship, hurled him down the gangplank, and he fell in front of them and then attempted to stand. But the badges conquered him with clubs, and he didn't defend himself from their blows because his hands were clasping a treasured object to his chest. One of the badges torturing him said, "Drop it." They didn't speak the language, but that's what the badge was saying. "Drop it," shouted the one who seemed to be the boss, and then he insulted the man. They didn't recognize the word, but they recognized the language of hate. But the man did not drop it, not until three badges wrenched one arm and three wrenched the other, and the object fell to the ground and popped open. And the boss picked it up, and though he had no doubt held objects like this one before, he was astonished to see that it was a compass. In that frozen moment in which the badges looked at the boss and the boss looked at the compass, and the man looked at the boss holding the compass and nobody knew what to do, he caught a glimpse of the tattoo on the man's back, on his shoulder blade, a glyph of a bird walking one way while looking the other. Then time unfroze. The boss snapped the compass shut, turned, and walked off. And his badges lifted the man up only to drag him off like a beast once more and disappear into the throng. Then everything kicked into action. The crane hoisting sailboats, the ships loaded with hay and coal, the cotton, so much cotton, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of bales of cotton, the mountains of produce being unloaded, the smell of fresh produce, the smell of rotting produce, the promiscuity of incomprehensible voices, the people bustling here and there, the smell of the people bustling here and there. To the left, dark water specked with lights. Ahead, the dim lights of lampposts. To the right, the twinkling lights of the city. They let themselves lurch between the stevedores and the men who suddenly began to swarm them, offering things and pointing this way and that. He leaned over to Pepe and shouted into his ear, did he have the address? Pepe looked stricken. What was it? What was it? A hotel. Mata had sent word that he'd wait for them at a hotel named for a city or a state. Or was it a person? Something with a C. Hotel Chicago, shouted into Pepe's ear. Pepe made squint eyes. Hotel Cleveland, Pepe dubitated, not dissenting, just dubitating. Hotel Cincinnati, he asked. Though the voices around them were a sea of unnavigable sounds, one of the squawkers accosting them beamed and face aglow said, Hotel Cincinnati, and tapped his own chest, Hotel Cincinnati, then gestured for them to follow. He shrugged and said to Pepe, let's go. And the city sucked them up like a sponge. So later, towards the end of the novel, he has engaged with different people in the city, and one of his friends, which is Tisbe Martin, which is a name that I actually took from a piece in the Times-Picayune. A person with that name actually was in prison for a while for helping an enslaved person escape. So he is meeting with this person in a sort of cabaret or a cafe. They were interchangeable, the names at that point. And he says, what does the drawing mean? Exactly what it looks like. That moving forward doesn't mean you abandon what's left behind. Sankofa. Like what? It's different for everyone. A history, a place, a person, yes. Tisbe looked at the dancers without seeing them. You're going home soon, right? Yes. Can you find my personal refuge? Who was this refugee to her? And where could he find them refuge? Yes, inasmuch as refuge is possible in a country at war. I think so, yes. Tomorrow, I'll write to make some inquiries. Tisbe nodded. I have to go, she said. You stay here a while, but first, come with me. I want to show you another conspiracy. She led him down a hall, opened the door to an inner courtyard, and gave him a gentle shove. The space was larger than the others he'd seen. An orchestra played, but nobody was dancing, or they were, but at a low frequency, as if dancing inward. He looked to his side. She was already gone. He approached the orchestra. 3 violinists were playing a waltz. Yes, it was a waltz, no doubt about it. He'd heard it in Oaxaca, back when he was governor. But this was something else. Behind the violinists, he saw the man with the very long drum. He didn't play the instrument so much as scratch at it with slack hands, almost as if by accident. A gentle stroke that turned into tapping when he switched from fingernails to fingertips, playing off the waltz without yielding to it. And the violins, despite following the beat, were also doing something different. They were having a conversation, each saying the same thing in their own pitch. All this time, the ingredients had been in front of his face. He'd simply never imagined them together. It was a miraculous invention, but incomplete. Could it be completed, or was that the miracle? That it never stopped spinning, scaling the walls.
Thank you both. I'd love to, again, hear you, kind of react, obviously, to these two passages together, but to this question of that, what these spaces of the port are doing in each of your novels.
Well, just listening Yuri read the last passage, I was thinking, what I usually read from Village Weavers is a part about Martha Jean-Claude, who became famous from taking part in the World Expo and recorded with Celia Cruz, a Cuban singer, because she infused her performances with the drumming, and so the syncopation. And so the idea that the syncopation of the city is part of also, and the inheritance from the African indigenous is a part of what creates, the noise and the life beat of whether it's New Orleans or I think Oaxaca too, because it's not a port city, it has that inheritance, and Port-au-Prince. So I was thinking about that relationship. But back to your original question about, the especially for Haiti, I'm hard pressed to think of many novels that don't take place in Port-au-Prince or in the surround, or if they take place in a rural area. So I'm thinking, I'm forgetting the title now, but there's some novels that are rural novels, but they always bring you back to Port-au-Prince in some way or other. I think of Masters of Adieu, for example. It takes place in a rural area. But in some ways, there is no Haiti without Port-au-Prince, which is becoming a big issue now with the paramilitary activity around Port-au-Prince, which is blocking, not only the routes into Port-au-Prince from the rural areas, but also people being able to bring goods into the country, into the port itself. But all of the life of Haiti really converges in Port-au-Prince. And then thinking back to Yuri's original first comments about the aid that came here after Katrina, I'm thinking about how Port-au-Prince was cut off from aid by the United States, actually, after the 2010 earthquake, and then how so many things had to come through the Dominican Republic. And so Port-au-Prince is vulnerable in many ways because its capital is a port city, and so much of life converges there, and people come for work there, which is why it's a city that is, was built for 250,000 and has millions, living there. And it's why the 2010 earthquake was so tragic, killing, in fact, 300,000 people and leaving, over 1 million food and home insecure. And so at this point, I think people are trying to rethink, where should the life heart of Haiti be? But the long history of Port-au-Prince is such that I don't think one can imagine Haiti without Port-au-Prince. And port is built into the name of the city itself. I'll just stop there.
No, I love this idea about the syncopation. I think we could think that is one of the main things in every port city. Because I'm thinking even if a port is fully and very well organized, it's a place that is designed to receive strangers, and that is designed to receive different kind of products from different places, and that creates this kind of syncopation of the place that can't be totally stable. And one thing that was important for me when I was thinking about the title of my book, in Spanish it's called La Estación del Pantano. And estación means both station and season. So it was impossible in English to have a word that had both things. So season was like more beautiful, well, like most, it was suggestive. But the thing with it also being a station is that it's a place where you prepare to go to somewhere else, And even if you can make it your home, it's a place that is always facilitating your movement, that it's always kind of introducing you as part of this syncopation. And I think that with the consideration of the very big differences that you can find in between ports, but that thing that you were saying, the syncopation, in a very concrete way, is one of the defining things of a port and a port narrative, I would say.
I just want to add one thing, because I think what's interesting is that we do think of ports as, when you're talking about welcoming strangers, one of the things, what struck me immediately is that in Port-au-Prince, there is a kind of a refusal of a stranger. And so I don't know what to do with that necessarily. But for example, going back to the 1805 Constitution, non-Haitians, which are sometimes defined as whites, but our term for foreigner is actually the word blanc in Creole. And so it doesn't mean that you're actually white, it just means you're a foreigner, an outsider, cannot own property in Haiti. And you wonder why that is, but it goes back to the revolution, it goes back to the redistribution of land, it goes back to who has the right to sovereignty. And of course, there are lots of workarounds. So before the First World War, Germans, married into Haitian society so that their wives would own, their factories or whatever the case may be. And that's still going on to this day. People have to intermarry in order to be able to hold property. But there is still this idea that Port-au-Prince is for Haitians and not for those foreign entities. So I'm thinking that through. So the logic in Port-au-Prince or in the relations, the international relations, has more to do with extraction than reception.
Yeah.
But it's really about using the port to extract things from Haiti, including labor, because of all the factories in Port-au-Prince, as opposed to actually bringing things in that the population can actually have use of. So that might be a bit of a counter port narrative for Port-au-Prince.
I think it's really texturally and sort of in the not the solitude, but the sort of space that you write in the novel. That is, it doesn't there. That piece of the syncopation maybe isn't there, or reads differently. But I mean,
no. I totally agree. What I think is that, of course, when your hometown is a door, which is what a port is in a way, you have to embrace or accept unpredictability, and that means invaders. That means also people that are not coming to really enrich your homeland, but to do some extraction from it. So that's in that way was that I was thinking about it. That the port is a sort of, it's literally a puerta, no? It's a door, and that you have to deal with the kind of things that come before the door.
I can't believe how quickly time is going. I was like, I need 8,000 questions, and all of a sudden, oh my gosh, we're almost halfway through. I as part of this, and it was in both of the passages, but in Yuri's in particular, but Myriam, I know it's such a part of your writing. Language is obviously key. It's been part of the conversations we've been having about multilingualism, Creole, and I wanted for you to talk a bit about how you. And Yuri, even in the English translation, in the writing of the book, you capture the multilingualism, and you made sort of conscious choices for how to display the language of the port city, and of exile and of diaspora. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about those choices.
Well, I always resist the idea that literature reflects the way people speak. I think literature creates its own version of the way people speak. Mm-hmm. And we create a sort of palette, the way the old painters had a palette of colors and they used it to mix the color that they want. I think literature does that with language, and that we have the right, maybe even the obligation, to not constrain our language to just one version of reality. And so in this case, what I did is that I read a lot of literature from the 19th century. I read literature in English from the 19th century from this same time. I listened to music, to things that have been recorded afterwards. And I just created something that would be useful for me for the goals that I had with this. So I wouldn't say at all that this book is a reflection of how people spoke. What I hope it would do is to recuperate some of the spirit of a cosmopolitan city in that sense, And we can't just repeat that happened and that is just lost. But we can reimagine the spirit of what it was, and I think one of the tools we have is to play with words, to play with language. And this is something that I enjoy a lot, and it's one of the reasons why translators sometimes hate me, because sometimes I just make up words or bring words from different spaces. But well, maybe sometimes they enjoy it. I don't know.
Oh, I was just thinking that's actually very Caribbean, the playing with words, like thinking about Césaire and Glissant and others. I mean, for me, so French is my first language, and obviously I grew up with Haitian Creole. working in English is about that play, having a kind of freedom to do things in English that maybe wouldn't be the first thought for an English speaker, first language speaker. I think it makes the work more poetic. It allows me more license. At the same time, I have a kind of burden to, I think, any writer who is coming from, a space that is misunderstood or misrepresented. There's a kind of burden to, within that license, to reflect something of the people that you're writing about. So with Village Weavers, I was working both with this idea of a cosmopolitan. I was writing essentially about my parents' generation, people who were born in the 30s, came of age in the 40s and 50s. Some left during the Duvalier period, some never returned. And that was my parents' story. But one of the things that characterized this generation is that they didn't live in exile. So people who left later or who were born during the Duvalier regime have had a tendency to think of themselves as exilic. And this generation, because they had an understanding of Haiti, a very profound understanding of Haitian culture before the Duvalier regime, they left, but they took Haiti with them. And so I wanted to capture this in the novel, the going to Paris, but still being Haitian, the going to the Dominican Republic and still being Haitian, the movement out and yet preserving your language, your food, as you're acquiring other languages and other habits, but never feeling like you're really participating in this new world where you might even have garnered citizenship. So the language needed to reflect, at least in the dialogue, where the characters speak themselves, a sense of who they were becoming in those different spaces, but also being attuned to the time periods and the generation they were a part of. So for example, the main characters, because they were born in the 30s, their Creole is very different from somebody who is speaking Creole today, who is in Haiti. And some readers have remarked on that. They wanted the Creole to be from 2024, 25. And it's like, well, no, these are people who are born in their 30s, so their Creole can't be your Creole. And having so that accuracy still be there. And then the character who moves to the Dominican Republic is mixing Spanish with Creole. And then those who go to Paris, obviously, are speaking in French. And so there are sections of the book, there are pieces of dialogue in all those languages which are transliterated, not completely translated in the text. So the reader is aware that the characters are not functioning in the English of the text. So there are kind of those kinds of registers that are at play. And hopefully then gives the reader a sense of the cosmopolitanness of Haitians, of different generations who circulate in the world with a kind of Haiti first, which is not a bad nationalism, but a kind of, resistance to, the outside world while still acclimating to new environments and new geographies.
I would be remiss if I didn't, again, refer back to Louis-Joseph Janvier's Haiti for the Haitians, which was, there's a chapter about it against free ports and against sort of, the 19th century rise of sort of finance capitalism and debt. So, sorry, I just had to get that in there.
Yeah.
Moderator privilege. So fast. I wanted to ask another question that's really related to the Port Cities theme and the center, which is to think about port cities as sites of malleability and transformation, which I think is at work, especially you're in your novel, but I think Myriam also in ways too, but also as ways of sort of resisting or reforming sort of existing structures. And I want to maybe think more broadly about resistance, and now I'm going to try and add another question and have me repeat if I'm not being clear. I've been really interested in thinking about these questions of flow that we've been talking about, network, circuits maybe, edge, port, sort of these different formations. But what you had mentioned, Myriam, about the port as being both, the coming in and the extracting in Yuri as well, but then the sort of interior, which again, I'm envisioning Port-au-Prince in particular, but a lot of Caribbean port cities where the interior or the hinterland or the mountains or the whoever on the inside are sort of separate as well. Or thinking about the port where the famous, cruise ships go in the north of the city and where there's like a real, wall between those two spaces. And so where resistance or how resistance plays out both like within the port city itself, invisibility, visibility, opacity, but also how, oh, now I'm really starting to go off. Maybe I'll just leave it there. Those are some thoughts. Ports is resistance, what that resistance looks like, right? Kind of in the broadest sense.
You want to start?
To structures of repression, yeah. Okay.
One of the things that I have learned is that people don't like New Orleans to be called a resilient city for good reasons. Because that is a word that is thrown at you just to define you as someone who would just take any kind of violence directed against you. That you would just come back from any tragedy, that you would just come back from any humiliation. And that puts you in a sort of passive role, you know. So I always try to think and try to speak about New Orleans, not in terms of resilience, but in terms of resistance, and even in terms of rebellion. And that means not to ignore all the terrible things that have happened and that still happen, but what you do with them. And the way in which I try to convey that, and that has to do with the second excerpt that I read, is that even though in this moment, which is 1855 when that scene is happening, the end of slavery is still not a reality, and the Civil War is still not happening, and the respect for Black African culture is still not a reality. The ingredients for that are already there. And what Benito Juárez is witnessing there is this mix, this violent clash of Western culture and African culture, even if white people were still not recognizing this as culture, you know, but just as noise. And one of the main ideas for me in this book is that Benito Juárez learned in New Orleans not what he could have learned in any other place in the books, because he was extremely well educated. He started to become a priest and then abandoned that, and then he turned into a lawyer, and he was a congressman and a governor and a judge. So he knew all those things. So my hypothesis is that what he learned in New Orleans is something that was not codified in books, but codified in notes, that was codified in music, and that he must have been a witness to this thing that was happening, that in a way is a way to rebel the idea of high culture or the Western canon of the time, and that what he was witnessing is a way of reimagining the world that could in that moment only be put in musical notes, that it was so unthinkable that it was not yet ready to be put as a set of laws or as a philosophical text. But in its way, it is a philosophical text, that music that he was saying and that he was hearing, and it is, I would say, a form of rebellion that not necessarily was in a physical way. Well, all the music is physical. Yeah.
I have so many thoughts. And that question is very complicated that you asked us. When I think of Haiti and I think of port cities, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind, and I'll try and see if I can connect it to the novel, is Marlène Do's biography of King Christophe that came out last year. And she spends a lot of time giving you a kind of map of Cap-Haïtien, which is the other port city in the north, which a lot of people today would like to see become the new capital of Haiti because it's not suffering of indignities of Port-au-Prince. But what she maps is, and this is before Christophe becomes the king of northern Haiti, are the ways in which free people of color, formerly enslaved populations, so post-revolution or during the revolutionary period, are really creating their own understanding of the city as a Haitian, so indigenous in that sense. And it's a spectacular mapping because you really feel like you're in this city. You can smell the smells of it. You can smell the sea air. You feel all the potential of what could happen in this new nation where everyone is ostensibly supposed to be free, right? So the first true imagining of what it would mean to have no racial, ethnic, religious constraints. But much of what happens, as she details, that relationship between Cap-Haïtien and Port-au-Prince, is that much of an embattled nature of a new nation between actors who want to take control of Haiti or want to, chart its court, is happening in the interior. So I don't actually think you can think of the port cities of Haiti as being only open onto the ocean and having their own life separate from the rest, of the half island, and sometimes the whole island, because Haiti was both the DR and what is now modern-day Haiti. But you have to think of the interior as being in conversation with the port cities. One other way you could think about this, and I try to imagine this maybe a little bit more in What Storm with Thunder, where one of the main speakers was a market woman than in Village Weavers, but you have this idea of this a resistance that is happening in a parallel economy and a parallel understanding of how people exchange among each other. So you have to think of especially present-day Haiti or even 2009 Haiti, so before the earthquake, where per capita income was about 900 USD. I think today it's maybe back up to 1,000 or 1,500. But you're talking about the vast majority of Haitians actually making no money, because that per capita income includes the middle class, the working class, and the millionaires, which exist in Haiti. And so most people are actually living without any hard currency at all. Everything is about barter and exchange. And the combit system, which is the community system of exchange, goes back to the African inheritance, so to the colonial period. So within the interior, there are people who, even right now, the grassroots, organizing in combits. So, so when people talk to the grassroots today, what should we do about Port-au-Prince, or, what is happening with the paramilitary, they will talk to you about the combits and how they are organizing in this parallel world that the superstructure doesn't see, that the international community doesn't understand, that the main actors in Port-au-Prince and government don't understand, but that is also operating in Port-au-Prince, especially through the market women, right? So, so my sense of resistance in a port city like Port-au-Prince is that it is intricately attached to the rest of the country. To bring it to what I was talking about in Village Weavers in the 1940s, and maybe going back to the flow of people into Haiti, so many people came for that expo, right, at the end of the 40s. But they didn't go necessarily in the way that people are going now to extract. They went because they wanted to learn about Vodou. They wanted to learn about the music, which is called Racine music. They wanted those engagements in that exchange, and they understood it had something to do with them, especially the jazz musicians who went in at this time. Now, the expo, occurs. I know about it because my grandfather was a foreman on those buildings. But I didn't know about all of what was happening on the ground. And only in looking back at maps of that period did I come to understand that the Parliament buildings, which fell in 2010, were the expo buildings that were built by Haitians at the time, and actually most of them designed by Haitian architects and engineers. I also have a wing of my family which are engineers, which is to say that the resistance is also in what was possible in prior decades on the ground in terms of knowledge on the ground about how things should be built. And there's a connection with New Orleans, with the gunshot houses, and so forth. But knowledge that was built on site, and those buildings took decades before they were impaired and fell. So that means that there was an understanding of what could stand on the ground there. So it's hard for me to think through all of the ins and outs of your question, but I'm
I think you did
okay.
everything. Like, that was
but
excellent.
that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah.
Okay.
30 minutes on the dot. This is what I would, of course, like to keep asking lots of things. However, we have a brilliant room full of people, and I would love to have your questions. We have microphones or microphone, but I was actually hoping, Nathaniel, that you could kick us off as chair with a question.
Thank you all for that. So many fascinating subjects. I'm curious to know, I was thinking as you were speaking of this great photography project by a photographer named Richard Sexton, who published this book called Creole World, which collected photographs he took of essentially port cities, New Orleans and Caribbean port, colonial cities, including Port-au-Prince. And he would have these sort of comparisons. Everything was a 2-page spread. You'd have like very similar forms. And essentially the premise was that this is the cultural community that New Orleans is in, as opposed to, I don't know, the Deep South or the US, or that this is the, and I was curious to know whether you felt writing these novels a kind of literary community of novels about port cities. I mean, maybe you didn't think of it in these, probably didn't think of it in these terms, but were there literary inspirations for you? And I'm curious to the degree to which those might have tracked with the idea of a port city. You know, sort of sub-question is also like so much of what you're talking about I associate with cosmopolitan literature more broadly, but obviously there are some slight distinctions perhaps to be made between a novel about a metropolis and a novel about a city that's also a port. But yeah, essentially literary models, literary sort of cousins that you see out in the world for the works that you wrote.
Well, I actually had two models that were important to me when I was thinking about the book, and I have never reflected that actually those novels happen in ports. One is one of the best Latin American novels that nobody reads because it's a little bit boring, but it's amazing. And Lucrecia Martel turned it into a movie that is just like the novel, a little bit boring and extremely beautiful. And it's called Sama by Antonio Di Benedetto. And it's this guy in the Rio de la Plata, and he's just waiting to be transferred during colonial times to a different outpost. So, of course, it has to be a little bit boring because you are just waiting. You're not doing anything else. And it's about the passage of time, and it's about the importance of hierarchies, you know, about the symbolic place where you are, but also it's about just waiting for the right boat, you know. And that is a book that was really important to me in terms of that, of thinking a character whose main activity is to wait, and meanwhile things happen to him. And the other one is a book by Matthias Enar that I never remember the whole title because it's pretty complicated, but it's something like tell them about battles and elephants and marbles, something like that. And it's about the period that Michelangelo spent in Istanbul designing a bridge that was never built. And it's also how a guy coming from what was supposed to be the pinnacle of culture goes to an extremely cosmopolitan city that he doesn't fully understand, you know, and that he is just conspiring how to come back, which was one of the things that was interesting to me, while at the same time trying to make something out of that carnivalesque city what was Istanbul. So, and only now that I'm thinking both novels happened in ports, but I never thought about it like that. So, well, it's a good accident.
Yeah, thank you for the question. In my case, I can't say, but I was thinking about port cities. because again, Port-au-Prince and Haiti, and I am from Port-au-Prince, so it would be natural for me to write about Port-au-Prince directly. But I think, and Village Weavers in particular, at this point I'm thinking is part of a trilogy, the third of which I'm working on now, which has to do with grieving, actually, grieving and loss, because the last book was on the 2010 earthquake and it was a polyvocal novel in 10 voices, and then this novel is in 2 voices, and then the next I thought was going to be in 1, but probably be 2. But kind of moving from the collective grieving process to something more familial in this novel, where 2 families that are connected together are suffering loss, and then the next novel will be a father and a child. And so in that sense, I think so much of Caribbean literature is about, grief processes, as well as, connecting to the multiplicity of voices and cultures that make up the Caribbean. So I would situate my work more in that kind of tradition. And in this particular novel, and with each novel, I try to rethink what can the novel do as a vessel, as a recipient. So the last novel had those 10 voices, only one of which repeated, which I only recently realized it was probably influenced by Maryse Condé, Crossing the Mangrove, which is in 19 voices and is actually quite short, which is, anomalous for her. But this novel is actually a circle, in that you begin in the present day in the first part and you end in the present day in the last part, but the middle sections are in one or the other of the main characters in different times that they have both lived through but not together. And then how they remember things that are, or how each of them conceives of their relationship is quite different. So I was really trying to think through, how do you narrativize memory when people think they have memories in common, but they simply don't. And so the novel takes you through this kind of memory work, trying to understand what the 2 characters, are grappling with in terms of their inheritance. And so it's more circular, but again, that is also very much part of the tradition in Caribbean writing, cyclical kinds of narratives, rather than a chronology, rather than a linear narrative. So breaking away. So in that sense, it might be part of what we used to call in Caribbean studies resistance literature, which is kind of speaking back to a canon rather than being part of a canon. But other influences might be Chamoiseau, again, Glissant, thinking about, how you're trying to communicate, or things that you don't want to communicate clearly, to your reader, or having multiple registers in the novel for different kinds of readers. But no port cities influence mine particularly.
One here and then one next to you.
Thank you so much for both your readings and what you had to say. I'm particularly fascinated because I'm working on the literature of a port city myself. That would be Hamburg, Germany. And I recognize so many things that you were speaking about. So I hope my question is not too abstract. If it is, just ignore it. So I recognize 2 things that seem to be like opposed to each other. On the one hand, the port city is like the great leveler of institutionalized structures, right? Like interesting people come in and go out. Hamburg calls itself as like the city motto, the gate to the world. So we all love that. We all love that things get like liquefied there. On the other hand, especially in Myriam's reading, there's also like a danger to that, right? We might not like that. It's also a place of extraction. Yuri, you mentioned the bales of cotton in the harbor of New Orleans. So there's also a risk to that. And my question is there maybe like a secret third option between like praising the port city as the great challenger of structures, and like condemning it and saying like we want the gate to the world shut because it's actually not working for us. In the context of my own research, I'm thinking mostly of organized labor in the harbor, which is kind of like in between, right? It still has the opening to the world, but it's trying to kind of like organize things differently, to kind of like build a structure that is between like capitalist flow of wares and the hinterland. But I'm honestly not sure if there would be something similar in your port cities that you're dealing with. So that is my question: is there like something in between?
Well, interestingly, my in-between would be the spirit world. And I think that was the danger in the passage that I read, but it's a good danger if you know how to recognize it, right? In terms of Vodou and recognizing other ways of communicating or being in relationship with others, but also being in relationship with the natural world, which I think then exceeds this idea of the structure, the city structure of a port city, because then you're seeing a completely different infrastructure in the city that connects you to that greater, to the outside of a port. But in terms of labor, I mean, Haiti is in a very particular, difficult place, which is something I write more in my academic work and op-eds in Harvesting Haiti. I looked at this very specifically because Haiti has been unable, as a sovereign nation, to establish safeguards around labor, because this is part of how the international community relates to Haiti and Port-au-Prince in particular, in terms of factory development. And this was, in 2009, the UN solution to Haiti's poverty was building more factories, which is still the solution in 2025, so clearly not a solution. And so the inability to create a minimum wage, which was one of the reasons in 2004 that President Aristide was taken out of the country, and because he was going to go to international courts to demand reparations from France. So if you can't, in your own nation, control, the minimum wage, labor conditions, and so forth, then there's very little that can be done. But labor is one of the extractions being taken out of this port. Again, there's the informal economy, there's what people are doing around that, but it doesn't enable people to overcome, the extraction of their labor in that sense. But yeah.
No, I don't think it's a very abstract question. I think it's very pertinent and very interesting. I remember when I was living in El Paso, there was this idea that people who would leave the border and go inland one way or the other would talk about the portable border. And some people referred they would say the border is there where you find a tortilleria. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they were talking about something else, about a certain mentality that you travel with, and you were talking about this before. And I think that mentality has to do with how you envision your place in society in different ways, among them in political ways. What is the importance that you, as an agent of change, can have in this specific space of exchange of goods, of exchange of ideas? I think we can find many, many examples about it, but the only one that I would say right now is what the dock workers in Italy started doing to stop the genocide in Gaza, And I hope that that's the kind of example that we will see replicating more and more.
I kept the mic so I could ask the next question. So I want to ask a question about migration, and maybe it's too complicated to get a good answer, but I thought you are wonderful people with whom to think with, also everyone in the room. I'm thinking about the idea of the port as a welcoming space and the way that was complicated a little bit versus the state of Latinidad and Latino migrants in New Orleans, right? Where I believe it's a hostile place towards migrants. The state of Louisiana certainly is, maybe the city of New Orleans a little bit less, but this is not a fun place to be a migrant. So it's a place of passing through, but when people have to make lives in New Orleans, it's not a cosmopolitan place. It is not necessarily, in my view, and maybe Yuri, you disagree, and you can say there are some really complex racial politics that are underneath that of Latinx anti-Blackness kind of being alongside a central Black Latinx presence, right? Haiti, Garifuna, Caribbean migrations into New Orleans. So, like pushing beyond the transit and like what happens when people are here. That's my question.
Well, I think that goes back to what I was saying in my opening comments, that I was invited into Louisiana under the premise that I would find a home. And I have to say, I mean, I was here for a little under 2 years, and I'll say this in the most diplomatic way I can say it, because it was positive in some ways. For me, it was like being here for 20 years. Like, I learned so much. It was such a profound experience. I was also here during the election that took Obama into the presidency the first time, and it was a profound experience, but it was a deeply disturbing one, in terms of racial dynamics, in terms of intercultural, interethnic, interracial dynamics. And I was actually very surprised by the anti-Haitianism, which I know has this longer history going back to the revolution. But I was surprised because there is a lot of resistance in this city, to all kinds of racializations that sometimes does not extend to, Afro-Latinidad in this sense. And I'm also burdened by the fact that, so in Village Weavers, because there is a section that takes place in the Dominican Republic, Haitians today are really encountering so much anti-Haitianism, anti-Blackness, to be blunt. In the Dominican Republic, Haitians have been denationalized. So Dominicans of Haitian descent, I will be specific, they are actually citizens. They are Dominican. They are Black Dominicans, have been denationalized since 2013. Since 2013, which means they cannot leave. And if they leave, they can't come back. So they're stateless, right? Michelle Stevenson has a great film about this called Stateless, which explains the situation very clearly. So there's that problem. So if you can't trust so with Haitians, if you can't trust your neighbors, and if you're within your own country of the Dominican Republic, you are not at home, then where do you go? And then this gets complicated and refracted when Haitians leave, Haiti, or Dominicans of Haitian descent leave that area and go somewhere else. They're also rebuffed. In the Bahamas, where you would think people would be welcome, have a similar history, again, there's a very deep, profound anti-Haitianism, and in fact, people look very much alike, but will convince you that they cannot be mistaken for Haitians, because then Haiti becomes the symbol for Blackness. And in fact, in the Dominican Republic, Haitian is synonymous with Blackness and is a slur, So your question really is about, so New Orleans, but other ports, where is the welcome, and how, and when we think of, I would say Florida and New Orleans as part of the Caribbean, what happens to Latinidad and what happens to inclusion of these migrants in these port cities. I don't know that there's a good answer, because I think the people come and they reestablish community, but often closed off from one another, with an attempt to communicate about, music and different ways of thinking or language. But there is also a kind of refusal to actually, I think, to examine the history that brings us together and the ways in which we have resisted alongside one another. This is especially true for Haiti and the Dominican Republic, because the ways in which things have been restructured benefit certain people more than others, and we don't want to lose. So we don't understand that there's a lot more to gain to re-examine the history and see how it actually coincides and lines up, and how we might create new ways, new allyships. It's easier not to, because we don't want to be the people who are, taken away in a certain sense. But we'll all be taken away eventually if we don't start lining up and understanding how we are connected. I'm hoping at one point we will get to a place where, because so many people rebuff Haiti because of what's happening now, what's been happening for decades. But if we went back to the original definition of what Haitian, being Haitian meant and what Blackness meant after the revolution, which meant that you were a human being, but that you understood the roots of your identity in an African space, spiritual and otherwise, I think we would be in a very different place. And we, for Americans who read James Baldwin, this is James Baldwin saying in The Fire Next Time, there is no such thing as white and black, right? What there is a common humanity, and recognizing that those things you think are repulsive are actually the basis for love and commonality and connection. And if you're able to recognize it, right, in Harlem and see the beauty in it, then you are able to create a new world. But we're very far away from that. But maybe some of us are closer.
Well, what I would say is, I agree with you. I know why you thought I was going to disagree with you. The racial relations in New Orleans is extremely complex. But still, I would say it's a cosmopolitan city because cosmopolitanism doesn't mean absence of conflict. And this is a little bit in the way in which I was talking about cosmopolitanism in the 19th century, when black culture was not recognized still. But still, it was as cosmopolitan society because that existed, even if the powers that be wouldn't recognize it. And in a different way, I think that is something that still happens now. I very often think about a novel by a British guy called China Miéville called The City and the City in order to describe certain aspects of New Orleans. In this novel, which is a sort of detective or noir novel, there's a guy who has to find out what happened with a crime. But the problem is you have these two societies that both of them claim that they got there first, and they occupy the same space, but that space is kind of intermingled. And the only law that they have in common is that they cannot acknowledge the other one. And sometimes when I see the way in which New Orleans is defined from the outside especially, and from some institutions here as just as an opposition between black and white, I think about that. And I think about one of the best things that this city have that is a radio station, WWOC, and that every hour they tell you what's the music that they have, and it's amazing. They never talk about the music in Spanish that happens a lot here. Sometimes like people like Peso Pluma that are some of the most important musicians in the world, or Residente that came like 3 years ago and played in Siberia, and they didn't even mention. Because it's something that is outside of the way in which the city is imagined. So yeah, there is conflict, and it's really complex. But that doesn't mean that these people that are ignored are not part of the cosmopolitanism of the city.
Yeah, I think I'd like to add to that it's also how we define cosmopolitanism in intellectual, intellectual traditions, right? So one of the things I do in Village Weavers, but also in my academic work, is really think about what are the circuits for people of African descent. And you could do this with different ethnicities or backgrounds. So in the novel, when one of the characters goes to Paris, she ends up finding out that other Haitians are involved in the Algerian resistance movement, right? And that came from knowledge that I had from my mother, who to French people looked like an Algerian woman. So she knew a lot about so I grew up knowing about Algerian resistance. And so what are the kinds of mappings that occur when people migrate to another place by will or by force? And who do they connect with, and what other kinds of resistance movements are made possible by that? So if a Haitian goes to France and is involved in the Algerian resistance movement, or Cubans go to Angola, there's these exchanges. Cosmopolitanism can be defined in a very different kind of way, where the world looks very different and history looks very different if viewed from a non-European perspective, actually.
I think this is a perfect end. We have lunch. I want to thank our speakers again.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. This was really wonderful. So appreciative.
Thank you for your questions.
It was great. I'm gonna get this.
Yes,
one.
lunch in the room over here.
No, I'm not gonna steal yours. But I also want you. Oh, I was in that one in
You were
Trinidad.
there?
In Trinidad,
Ah.
maybe not in the same. You won there?
I won this last year,
Oh,
yeah.
I was